In many ways, California is an incredible success. If it was an independent country, it would be the fifth largest economy in the world, with a GDP larger than India and the UK, and soon about to overtake Germany. It would be among the 5 countries with the highest GDP per capita, richer than Switzerland and every single Scandinavian country. It's home to 10% of the 1,000 largest US companies. It has significant reserves of oil, and it's both the technological and cultural capital of the United States. In almost every aspect, California's economy is extremely impressive. But despite doing absolutely amazing, it's somehow doing incredibly bad at the same time. For the past 2 years, California has experienced an exodus of both people and companies that are leaving for other states, so much that its population has now begun to decline for the first time in history. Its residents are being crushed by the enormous costs of living, a devastating housing crisis, and constantly rising inequality. And despite having higher taxes and larger budget than any other state, it has the highest poverty level in the entire United States, and it has by far the highest rate of homelessness in the country. But how is that possible? How can a state do so well and so bad at the same time? And when and why did this happen? And can California overcome the problems that it's facing, or is everything bound to get even worse? This is the dark side of California. California has always had a special kind of appeal, at least since the mid-1800s, when it discovered large reserves of gold, starting the Great Californian Gold Rush, and making hundreds of thousands of people head west. That's when the idea of the California dream was first born, the vision of quickly gaining money and wealth in a land of opportunity where those who are not afraid to risk can achieve anything. But the modern Californian economic miracle happened much later, in the mid-20th century, when the economy started exponentially growing and its population doubled in just 20 years. And the thing that made it happen was war. Once the Second World War started, California became the place where most of the military equipment was made. And once the war ended and the Cold War began, this trend continued. As America started putting billions of dollars into an arms race with the Soviet Union, its military-industrial complex was born, and most of it was based in California. This new industry was making an insane amount of money and needed millions of new employees, and so the Californian economy and population grew faster than ever. And the military industry was also what turned California into a global technological hub. A lot of the cutting-edge technology at the time was invented by the military, and 40% of the entire military budget for research and development was going to California, where it naturally created an ecosystem of innovative companies able to design and create high-tech products. And these companies were able to benefit from another great strength that California had: a network of excellent universities that weren't just producing highly qualified graduates, but also pioneering a new approach to how academic research could be used. Universities like Stanford were engaging in joint research projects with the military and private companies, and encouraging their students to take their ideas into the real world and turn them into businesses. And this environment led to the emergence of venture capital, companies that were willing to fund all of these potential ideas in exchange for part of their future profits. The combination of private and government money, quality universities, a network of private companies, and the atmosphere of innovation and entrepreneurship created an incredibly potent and powerful mix. This environment created some of America's largest and most successful companies, and a number of highly paid jobs, attracting skilled and motivated people from all over the United States, further fueling the economy. And then, as everything was going great, somehow it all started going downhill. So it's the middle of the 1970s, and California is at its peak. The economy is doing great, as both the defense and tech sectors keep growing, and the population is increasing as well, as more and more people are moving there for the opportunities it offers. But while this is happening, something starts to change. And while at first it doesn't seem like a big deal, eventually it turns out to be the first nail in the coffin of the California dream. In the 1970s, the state saw the rise of a movement that later became known as NIMBY, not in my backyard. It wasn't really a single organized group, but rather a growing tendency among local people to refuse, reject, and fight against any kind of construction and development in their neighborhood. While perhaps understandable, the problem is that if no one wants anything to be built in their area, nothing will be built anywhere. And unfortunately in California, this demand for NIMBYism was quickly picked up by local politicians, and it soon resulted in policies that were at the core of many of California's problems of today. First, California changed its zoning laws, introducing very strict regulations for what kind of real estate were people able to build in certain places. Many areas across the state started to only allow the construction of single-family homes, meaning that most of California started to look like this rather than this. At the same time, the increased concern for the environment led to even stricter regulation and to designating more areas for environment preservation, further limiting the supply of available space for construction. And finally, California gave a much larger role in land use decisions to communities of local homeowners, who now became involved in the development and approval process. But the people who already owned a home in the area generally didn't want more construction and more people to move in, because it would decrease their comfort and the value of their property. And so in most cases, the local involvement meant that even less housing was being built. But meanwhile, the population continued to grow, and so the prices started quickly going up. From 1970 to 2016, home prices more than quadrupled, and they grew 80% faster than in the rest of the United States. And while the home prices were exponentially growing and they started to become less and less affordable, the economic situation shifted as well. In the early 1990s, the Cold War ended, and after 4 decades of perpetual arms races and enormous military spending, the United States was finally able to take its peace dividend. But this was bad news for California. After 5 decades of growth, the military and research budget was massively reduced, and the funding for California's defense industry dried out, and that had catastrophic economic consequences for the state that was still dependent on it. Unemployment and poverty skyrocketed, as a lot of the big companies went under, while the rest moved out from California to states with lower taxes in order to save money. And even though after a few years California's economy began to grow again, something has irreversibly changed. Hundreds of thousands of blue-collar jobs employing regular everyday people disappeared, and they never came back. And instead, they were replaced by a much smaller amount of high-paying, high-qualified jobs in the tech sector. But there were not enough of them to employ all the people who were let go, and they were often taken by highly skilled people coming to California from all over the US. Now, from the perspective of the state, it didn't matter. The growing tech sector was able to fully replace the defense industry in terms of the value it produced and tax revenue it provided. But it did matter for the local people, because the tech sector did not provide nearly as many jobs, and this led to a massive increase of inequality, as a lot of decent paying jobs were replaced by a few highly paid jobs, and the number of those who were in the middle started going down. And meanwhile, as this was happening, the cost of living and housing was still going up. And finally, something else started to happen as well. As housing was becoming much less affordable and blue-collar jobs were disappearing, the California government decided to slash funding for social programs, including for state-funded mental institutions. Without the state money, these places were not able to treat people anymore, and many had to close down, resulting in thousands of people with severe mental issues being kicked out on the street. And that has accelerated another trend that California has already been experiencing since the 1980s, a significant growth of its homeless population, driven by rising cost of living and the fact that the federal government has cancelled funding for construction of cheap, subsidized housing for people living in poverty. And as this was slowly becoming more and more significant problem, California reacted by adopting a policy that became known as tolerant containment, now widely considered to be a failure. Basically, the policy of tolerant containment meant that homeless people were pushed to move to several containment areas, where they were allowed to camp on a street, and where they were often provided amenities by the local government. This was an opposite to the strategy of cities like New York, which has a similar percentage of homeless population as LA, but runs a system of state-funded shelters. In California, the idea was that the problem would be contained to a few small areas, and it would not cost the government anything. But over time, as the homeless population grew, the containment policy was not sustainable anymore, and without the system of shelters, it quickly grew out of hand. Today, California has over 170,000 homeless people, by far more than any other state in both absolute numbers and per capita. While California only makes up 12% of the US population, it's home to 30% of the country's homeless population, and the number has been quickly and steadily rising. Since 2017, its homeless population has increased by 40,000, meaning that in 5 years, it rose by almost 1/3. And as sad as it is, it's also one of the main reasons that people cite in their decision to move out of the state. So what's ahead for California? Well, unfortunately for the Golden State, at least its short and midterm future is not looking great. While its population decline might slow down, it's unlikely to stop or reverse, as 50% of California's residents are considering leaving the state. Although the government is aware of the housing crisis and it says it wants to encourage more construction, so far they failed to deliver any actual results. The inequality and disbalance between the poor and the rich keeps growing, and so is California's homeless population. And while its economy is still going strong, if the trend of companies leaving the state because of declining living conditions and high taxes continues, it will eventually feel the impact as well. And even now, California's massive budget is not big enough to cover all of the state's expenses. And so if nothing changes, the future of the Golden State is not looking very bright.